Silvio first, let me see. Silvio first and Alejandro second, right? Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to our concluding third panel. I just heard we don't have the closing remarks, right? We just go on until we're exhausted and go straight to dinner. No? No? Okay.
Dinner? No.
It was wishful thinking from my side. No?
Given that it's the last night, we can finish with the panel and then we can even take a small break before reconvening for dinner. It's up. I'm open. You could go if you want to relax a bit and then meet for dinner or go straight to Mizian.
Dinner is
Mizian. So it's really. Yeah, so the dinner is at 8:30. So my suggestion is we end.
We can follow.
Just a slight breath of air and then. Yes, and then everybody can make their way to the dinner.
Okay.
Freely. Yeah.
Okay, done.
So we finished the panel on time.
Good. So then let me briefly introduce our two last speakers for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Silvio Carneiro on the right to me. He's a scholar in the fields of critical theory, contemporary political philosophy, philosophy of education, and philosophy of psychoanalysis. And he's a professor at the Federal University of ABC, or UFA-ABC in Brazil. He works as a member of the board of directors of the International Herbert Marcuse Society, and with a focus on critical theory, education, psychoanalysis, and politics. He's also the coordinator of the Brazilian part or segment of Extimacies, critical theory from the Global South. And in this context, he inquires into the dialectics of violence with a particular emphasis on the dual role of violence as a significant component in both revolutionary emancipation and totalitarian terror. Let me also briefly introduce Alejandro to my far right, left from you, of course. Far left, as I said, from you. From the far left. But look how bad it would be to be a liberal centrist otherwise, so I didn't say that. Alejandro Cerda-Ruda is a Mexican psychoanalyst practicing in Mexico City. He is a co-partner also in the Mellon Foundation's project Extimacies. He obtained his doctorate from the European Graduate School in Saas-Fee, Switzerland, and he's a postgraduate professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana, as well as a guest professor at the Freudian Society of Mexico City. Since his foundation in 2009, he has served as the senior editor of Paradiso Editores. His selected publications are, I only mentioned three: Sex and Nothing, Bridges from Psychoanalysis to Philosophy, with Routledge in 2016, The Penumbra of the Subject, Contribution to a Freudian Metapsychology, Prometeo 2019, and at the moment he's working on a new monograph called The Attraction of Incest and the Exogamic Solution. The floor is yours. Please, Silvio, start first and then.
Okay.
Wait.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Sammy, for this nice presentation, and Nadia for the organization. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am in thank you, and I would like to thank you all for this exciting presentation of Lacanian perspectives of a lot of problems that I am trying to make some connections with Marcusian perspective. Well, I read some of this text for you. I will start now. Rereading Freud today demands a careful examination on new dimensions of the connections between psychoanalysis and politics. One of the most influential reading of Freud for critical theory certainly is Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, in which we can follow Freudian revolutionary trends regarding the social and subjective changes after the World War II. From the cultural and economic transformations during this time, Marcuse regards the importance to rereading Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. In an advanced industrial society, what does such a feeling of discontent mean? Could this new horizon keep an emancipatory sign? In this sense, Eros and Civilization opens a debate on utopian revolution beyond the repressive structures, a new perspective based on the instinctual struggle between Eros and Thanatos. However, it's not only a question to translate Freudian psychoanalysis into a metaphysical question. In other words, biological foundations are necessary for social change, as Marcuse proposes later in an essay on liberation. But what sort of biology does it represent? Life appears in many ways in Marcuse's work, but I'd like to present it by the Marcusean diagnosis of the paralysis of criticism. In one-dimensional man, life appears as an important aspect to his criticism. It's remarkable the time when he writes this book. In 1964, Marcuse suspected that criticism was under its own limits. Social relations have changed after the experience of the World War II in a deep way. Old structures, as family, work, and even culture, were under deep change. Some years later, Marcuse will formulate an important paradox for his time. I quote here Marcuse. It makes no sense to talk about liberation for free men, and we are free if we do not belong to the oppressed minority. Then a new order arises and the criticism must change its own perspective about it. And I think that it makes some connections with Carlos said yesterday. That is, the alienation of the working class at the first industrial revolution has been changed in the middle of the 20th century. In the advanced socio-industrial society, where global south appears as a dominated territory, the working class was deeply identified with the American way of life. They are not only alienated people, but also an active, free subject who was supporting the establishment in which they live their dreams. How do we criticize it? According to Marcuse, the paralysis of criticism faces the historical limits of the criticism too. At the first moment, the critic of the ideology was a claim against the illusions of the system of life. In this sense, denunciating the absorption of the working classes by structures of power would be the fire alarm for social revolt. However, when Marcuse declares that the critical claim for free human beings has an empty meaning, he is remarking the insufficient effort of such criticism. In the industrial advanced society, the traditional criticism is just reduplicating discourses of liberty in an unequal society. The denounces against the social exploration can mean an effort to improve the domination in an affluent society. From the so-called open society and its abstract defense of the formal right for free speech, opposition becomes integrated in the social totality. The opposition becomes secondary in front of the commodity form. Something changes inside the commodity form, and I think that our connections with Sami too here, something which mobilizes alienation as an active form of domination supported by the dominated people. Perspectives change, and the critique must go beyond the young Marx diagnosis, who said, what is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. In contrast to such an inverted world, Marx develops a radical perspective, denouncing this inverted world as an alienated existence. However, Marcuse notes a new twist of the domination. Working class in advanced industrial society can identify themselves with a society without alternatives, a one-dimensional society. Consequently, human beings are not human even in the inverted animal stage of their lives. The consumerism in the affluent society is structural for a society based on the illusionary individual liberties. Actually, all of the technological development is established as a part of an unsustainable system of life, in which ecological environment claims for change and people live their liberties in a less and less free world. Something that George Agamben will call the subhuman beings. From this changing, criticism needs to change too. And Marcuse starts from the most basic perspective. What is the meaning of life now, just now? Let me quote Marcuse's one-dimensional man. It's a big one. I start now. From the beginning, any critical theory of society is thus confronted with the problem of historical objectivity, a problem which arises at the 2 points where the analysis imply value judgment. And here is a model of critical theory that Marcuse are working in one-dimensional man. The first judgment is the judgment that human life is worth living, or rather can be and ought to be made worth living. This judgment underlies all intellectual effort. It is the a priori of social theory, and its rejection, which is perfectly logical, rejects this theory itself. There are no theory without life. The second judgment is the judgment that in a given society, specific possibilities exist for the amelioration of human life and the specific ways and means of realizing these possibilities. Then that is the quotation of Marcuse. End of quote. Life is thus the starting point of the critical theory, a possibility to mobilize criticism through an immanent way. In a twofold judgment, the critical exercise is close to the life as a value that reduplicates life as an a priori element, the life as a worth living, as well as a life as a part of the empirical system, a given society. Marcuse's attempt to mobilize criticism can be under suspect. Sometimes his judgment from the perspective of life is misinterpreted as a new idealism. It could be true if Marcuse's conception of life would be just an a priori without any relation to empirical world. However, it's remarkable that Marcuse's critical theory is a twofold judgment without any hierarchic position among them. The a priori life and the established life are on the same stage. The question is a negative one. These two forms of life present a blocked and contradictory experience. According to Marcuse, I quote, critical analysis has to demonstrate the objective validity of these judgments, and the demonstration has to proceed on empirical grounds. Therefore, end of quote. Therefore, it's not just a denounce against the life that could be existent, but the concrete possibilities of life as demonstrated on empirical grounds. Here, biology and human sciences are part of the same critical strategy that represents Marcuse's effort to articulate a lot of contemporary empirical studies with philosophical thinking. Sociology, psychoanalysis, and even natural science are absorbed in a critical discourse. Life is a concept that appears in these empirical studies in many different names. Then, Marcuse conceives life not just as a normative concept. On the contrary, life is a political question. According to the conclusion of the political preface to Eros and Civilization, I quote, today, the fight for life, the fight for Eros, is the political fight. End of quote. Biology here is a political dispositive rather than a normative presupposition. We cannot read this conclusion in the political preface without question about the locus psychoanalysis occupies in Marcuse's critical strategies. In other words, Rereading Freud in Marcusean terms means to elaborate the political and social trends in psychoanalytical theory. Because of the social change of a new twist of totalitarian trends in society, I quote Marcuse, traditional borderlines between psychology on the one side and political and social philosophy on the other have been made obsolete. And this word is very interesting, obsolete. In this sense, psychological categories becomes political categories. It can be another extimate paradox, but it's a question for another time. Let's move forward. According to Marcuse, the connection between political and psychological categories means to interpret Freud's biologism as his social theory. Contrary to the neo-revisionist rejection against to Freud metapsychological works, Marcuse remarks that these rejections cuts off, I quote here Marcuse, the roots of society in the instincts. There is a question about instincts and drives, but I will jump it. For Marcuse, Freudian biologism impels an instinctual connection that has been lost in the forms of life proper to the industrial and advanced in society. Biology must be interpreted inside the conflict and contradictions proper to life rather than a psychological theory about the mechanics of living beings. Eros and Civilization could be read as an answer to the final words of Freud's Civilization and its discontent. I would like to remember that's an amazing end. Human beings, I quote here Freud, have made such strides in controlling the forces of nature that, with the help of these forces, they will have no difficulty to exterminating one another, down to the last man. They know this, and it is this knowledge that accounts for much of their present disquiet, unhappiness, and anxiety. And now it is to be expected that the other of the two heavenly powers, immortal Eros, will try to assert himself in the struggle with his equality immortal adversary. But who can foresee the outcome? End of quote. Here is the Marcuse's fight for Eros. In defense of Freud's biologism, Eros and Civilization radicalizes a critical perspective of the biology and a dialectical trend to interpret the struggle between Eros and Eros and Thanatos as a social and political conflict. Therefore, biology is a political question. Marcuse's philosophy of psychoanalysis impels to think new categories of life, political and social categories in the psychoanalytical discourse of the instincts. In this sense, life is a locus for conflicts. Fighting for Eros demands to remark life as a part of the conflict, the instinctual one, the struggle for existence. Eros and Civilization's central question moves around such a conflictual viewpoint. Bios here is not a one-dimensional dynamic, but a twofold trend. It does not mean Marcuse defends a primordial loss of the existential conflict. On the contrary, the question here is to present life as a perpetual interaction between two sides of a tensioned relation, a dialectical way to think life a historical question. There is the internal structure of the organic life as well as the external influence on it. Marcuse follows Freud's beyond the pleasure principle to remark how does the organic life depart from an existential struggle. According to Marcuse, the dual primitive instincts, Eros and Thanatos, are not two distinct elements, but they are two different tactics to the same strategy. How does an organic living being escapes from the extreme libidinal energy that life demands from them? Both of these primordial instincts, Eros and Thanatos, are compulsions, I am quoting Marcuse here, are compulsions inherent in organic life to restore an earlier stage of things with the living entity has been obliged to abandon under the pressure of external disturbing forces. End of quote. On the one hand, death instinct answers to the tensioned life by the end of itself. On the other hand, Eros intensifies and enlarges instinctual gratification for the connection among organic living beings and its exogenous factors, sociological, we will see it. Here, the interesting step is the movement by external influences proper to the conflict rather than the starting point of it. Marcuse is not interesting to see when everything begins. As a part of the dynamic of life, Eros and Thanatos mobilizes themselves by external influences, reorganizing organism and its environment through new forms of sensibility and reason. External here is not a pure externality, a deus ex machina. I'd like to interpret external here as an extimate relation, because it is the sort of relation for interconnected instinctive structures. Eros and Thanatos are in constant and inseparable interaction. They are relative trends, both are the other of each other. Okay? If Eros and death instinct are dialectically connected between each other, we should question, why fight for Eros rather than Thanatos? Firstly, it does not mean the submission of Thanatos by Eros. They are interconnected, and submission is a perverted form of such instinctual relationship. Moreover, Eros could be reduced to a form of organized sexuality submitted to the performance principle of the enjoyment. The affluent society usually shows different examples of this trend: sexual relations mediated by commodities, narcissistic forms of performative love, hysterical bodies, and the daily doses of happiness to tolerate the established reality. There is no ideological dream of life without a piece of Eros. In the 60s, Marcuse conceives the potential conflict between the instincts regarding sexuality as a part of the repressive forces of the apparatus, rather than to conceive sexuality as a reason for liberation. For sure, Eros and Civilization's primordial thesis remains, I quote, "It's not the conflict between instinct and reason that provides the strongest argument against the idea of a free civilization, but rather the conflict which instinct creates in itself." That is, Marcuse remarks that these primitive instincts influence each other, and, it is an important part, they can change their combination according to historical changes too. There is a double level here. The first one, the phylogenetical biological level, a conflict between the two instincts for their inherent retrogressive drive towards the inorganic. The second one is the sociological level, a conflict between these two instincts regarding the libidinal economy in society. Here is the way in which Eros is an organized sexuality for social and gender divisions, and Thanatos becomes organized aggressivity and morality. Civilization processes and its political conflicts for domination create a fence between these two levels, something presented by Marx as alienation processes. But in the new twist of the ideology developed in the advanced industrial society and the neo-colonial territories, in the one-dimensional apparatus, even the instinctual conflict was integrated. According to Marcuse, I quote, "We have to live with the consciousness that technology has become an instrument of domination, the most rational domination, because it delivers the goods and makes life more comfortable for those who are accepted and the most irrational because it's accepted by its victims, who are no longer in need of liberation. There is just one residual element in all of this, a malcontent in the affluent society. It's the name of the text of Marcuse. It results from the same technological rationality that organizes living beings in biopolitical process, in which social, cultural, psychological apparatuses appear as a dehumanizing power of mechanization. People themselves become an essential part of this machine, and their individual liberal choices as consumers, as voters, or even soldiers, just conform then to the framework set by the pre-established apparatus. The malcontent appears as a symptom of such processes of reification. Alienation appears as a question mark. What is the meaning of all this instrumental reason? There are two answers for this, and I will end with this point. On the one hand, people can reinforce the logics of domination. According to Marcuse, that is the, I quote, that is the malcontent who blames against all common and scientific sense the apparatus, but succumbs to reification, and it reinforces a more authoritarian order, preserving the difference between ruling and ruled class. As a consequence, we can say that this malcontent just reproduces an ideology of aggression of the affluent society. Marcuse said sometimes ideology of death. It is manifested by reproducing the obscenity of the affluent society, that is not the picture of a naked people who expose their public hair, but that of a full-clad general who exposes his medals rewarded in a war of aggression, or that of the society indecently exposing the abundance of wares while depriving its victims abroad the necessities of life. For sure, outright movement moves around this conservative blame against the system to preserve the system. On the other hand, and that's my end words here, on the other hand, people can reinforce the logics for liberation. That is what Marcuse notes as a biological foundation for socialism. Again, he notes the necessity to change terms in critical theory in the contemporary times. Again, he notes how important is the value of life for this criticism as a biological foundation. Here, biological elements arise again as a source for criticism and political action. That is something Marcuse notes in the 60s when the, I quote him, instinctual revolt turns into political rebellion. It might be a melancholic view if you interpreted the movement of 60s as a victorious discourse. And then we have this kind of melancholic perspective today. But Marcuse would not say at that time that it is a victorious discourse. Indeed, Marcuse speaks more about the obsolescence of this sort of political movement than its victories. He saw a horizon for a counter-revolution that we can name as neoliberalism today. However, such obsolescence is part of the fight for eros. It is not a vision of defeat. On the contrary, is the way Marcuse found to say something like a desire for revolution. Such a desire does not arise from the manifestations. On the contrary, these manifestations, these protests, are the result of such a desire. That is, an answer to the malcontent in the affluent society. Something that is absent in the reality. Maybe a promise of happiness, a promise of the bonheur, that desire for revolution keeps with self. a new biology arises from this critical desire. That's the end. Thank you.
Is this okay? Both. Okay. Thank you, Sylvia. I am fully aware that this is the last panel and it's been 2 long days, so I'm gonna try and be as brief as possible. I wasn't aware that I was in the far right, but fortunately for you, I'm in the far left. So, first of all, I would like to thank Nadia and AUB for hosting this, and especially the Extimacies for this festival and sharing of ideas. It's been very, very productive. The work that I'm going to be sharing with you today stems from the workshop that we did in Mexico City, which concerned psychoanalysis and politics. These are a few reflections stemming out of that. The title of it is Totem and or Taboo, a study of an incomplete Freudian concept. When Totem and Taboo was published in 1913, Freud was concerned about its publication. Not only was it a text that Freud thoroughly worked for 4 years, having various colleagues revise it and signal certain points of approval and disapproval, but he was mostly concerned about its relevancy and cultural impact. He was all too eager to hear from Sir James Frazer a kind of response or rebuttal, which never came. It wasn't until 1920 when Alfred Krebs's contestation, perhaps the first important one, came about. For many years, Freud's text, although widely cited and reviewed within psychoanalytic groups, only remained as another social text to understand culture and its origins. However, we will analyze this text not only as a politically enriched opus, but also as a fourfold metapsychological writing that places clinical quandaries at its epicenter. Rather than presenting various attempts at resolving all sociological questions such as mass formation, omnipotent magical thoughts, or religious sacrifices, what Freud offers in this book is a crucial step in the constitution of the subject. Thus, Freud comes to proclaim that in every psychosexual development, as well as in all of our psychical life, a concept emerges whose main role is to account for certain fixations or structuring processes, not only for the psychical apparatus, but also for the insertion of the subject in culture. This process is what Freud defined as the current complex of neurosis, the bond with parents governed by incestuous appetites. It is important to underline that this nuclear complex, later named Oedipus complex, first came to Freud during his York process while mourning the loss of his father, Jacob, on the 23rd of October 1896. Although Freud wasn't that much attached to religious rituals, it is significant to denote that, similar to every mourning culture, the Jewish tradition has its own temporal modes of bereavement. The first 7 days after the death of the beloved person, celebrated by the name of Shiva, literally meaning 7 days, is followed by Shloshim, which is held 30 days after the funeral service and usually conveys the unveiling of the tombstone, as well as the shaving of the beard. However, all children from the deceased parent are expected to remain grieving until the first lunar year is over. After this 11 months, then the mourning process is lifted. For Sephardi Jews, this commemoration is named Nakala, or legacy. So what happened with Freud during this doleful year?
In his correspondence with Wilhelm Fliess, we find a few letters that can help our debate. For example, in draft N, written on the 31st of May, 1897, after telling Fliess about his over-affectionate feelings towards his one-year-old daughter, Mathilde, manifested in a dream, he prolongs this dream into an erotic scene with the maid. Also, the first glimpse of the Oedipus complex is described as follows, quote, hostile impulses against parents, a wish that they should die, are also an integrating constituent of neurosis. It seems as though this death wish is directed in sons against their fathers and in daughters against their mothers, end of quote. Finally, Freud finishes this draft by stating, quote, the horror of incest, something impious, is based on the fact that as a result of communal sexual life, even in childhood, the members of a family remain together permanently and become incapable of joining with strangers. Thus, incest is antisocial, end of quote. In letter 69, written on the 21st of September, 1897, after completing his Yahrzeit, Freud asserts, quote, I no longer believe in my neurotica, end of quote. This neurotica, although many people have confused her by one or many of his patients, Freud is clearly talking about his theory, more precisely his seduction theory. He no longer believes that trauma is caused by a direct impact upon a being in some sort of factual seduction, but by the mere production of fantasies that entail incestuous or parasital desires. Thus, Freud shifts from his theory of seduction to his theory of fantasy. Furthermore, in his next letter, written on the 3rd of October, Freud evidences his ambivalent feelings concerning the active role his deceased father has played during his life, and especially during the past year. And here I would like to make a parenthesis, sort of like following on this passage that Mladen told us concerning Freud going into Slovenian caverns. That happened in 1898 during the Passover Easter holidays, which is just a few months after the timeline that I'm drawing. And it got me thinking as if Freud was sort of going into caves in a resemblance to sort of going into graves, sort of looking for this dead father, but instead he found the dark father. He found Luga. Finally, on the 15th of October, 1897, letter 71, already a year after Jacob's death, we find the first statement concerning the Oedipus complex, quote, a single idea of general value dawned on me. I have found in my own case too the phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father. And I now consider it a universal event in early childhood, end of quote. Thus, we are left with two propositions concerning the Oedipus complex. Firstly, it is supplanted as Freud's resolution to his Yahrzeit, thus his legacy. And secondly, it is universal. If such concept is antiquated or outdated, then why is it that people still hang on to it during their lives? Is it still relevant to talk in such terms, clinically speaking? Or is this universality just another mode of production due to Freud's epoch and woeful bereavement? In such case, we can contest this idea with Slavoj's take on why Homer and Kieslowski are still relevant and universal. In The Fright of Real Tears, Zizek explains, quote, all great historical assertions of universal values, from ancient Roman Stoicism to modern human rights, are firmly embedded in a concrete social constellation. However, one should avoid here the historicist trap. This unique circumstance does not account for the truth and universal scope of the analyzed phenomenon. It is precisely against such hasty historicists that one should refer to Marx's famous observation apropos of Homer. It is easy to explain how Homer's poetry emerged from early Greek society. What is much more difficult to explain is its universal appeal. For example, why it continues to exert its charm even today. End of quote. Or in such similar matter, I take Mladen's article, Freud and the Political, to be quite illustrative of this. Quote, "For what is at stake in science, in establishing a scientific field, is the guarantee of the repeatable, the experiment in what is repeatable by anyone, universally available, and this is what ensures objectivity and verification. Whereas in psychoanalysis, one constantly deals with the singular, the singularity of symptoms, the singularity of a particular unconscious. For example, one deals with the non-repeatable. And it is from the singular that the universal has to be constructed." End of quote. So what is at stake in Freud's totem and taboo? In this sense, apart from the anthropological and social readings this text has to offer, we find that it portrays 4 clinical concerns for Freud. 1, attraction to incest. 2, the exogamic solution. 3, the problem of identification. And 4, symbolic parricide. If these 4 metapsychological concerns are aptly universal, it is left for clinical psychoanalysis to unveil them as new forms of subjectivities or as unedited figures of discontent or identity desertions that escape most of the therapists today. Our main concern is to understand that Freud, as of 1913, was not only focused on the origins of culture, but he was trying to ensure the politics of its institution. IPA was founded in 1910. And setting the grounds for the psychoanalytic technique. His technical texts began at 1910, 1912, and go all the way to 1915. In short, Freud was focusing his totemic work on the relationships that these 4 elements have in the edification of subjectivity. For example, the problem of identification is not only useful for the purposes of group identity, mass formation, or even power relations, but precisely on the incorporation of the qualities of the other in order to compose a body. What is a body has been a question revolving around post-Lacanian psychoanalytic thought up to Pierre Marty's studies on psychosomatics. What it is, what does it mean to give body to the body? Henceforth, what is at stake is not precisely the relevance of the Oedipal drama set during the sacrifice of the totemic animal, but my main concern is to understand what does this mean from a clinical standpoint of view. How is this relevant for analysts and psychoanalysts? Therefore, there is something more to be learned from Polynesia. Indeed, Freud begins the first part of Totem and Taboo, written and published for the Imago journal in 1912, evoking examples from Australia's primary settlers, in addition to Melanesian, Polynesians, and Malaysian people. Apart from the endemic characteristics totemic rituals and sacrifices have for this region, we should ask if we can consider ourselves exempt from such rituals. What if the capitalistic discourse is our new mana, a new form of generating fetishistic needs of cruel domain? According to Andy Fomentel, she asserts that language can be seen as our new totem. Don't we sacrifice our most vulnerable selves and everything to it? However, one of the questions that triggers Freud's interest beyond the totemic theme, magic or religion, is presented as a problem of community. How can we understand community beyond any form of religious foundation of liaison? In short, what is shared by a community, and especially by a psychoanalytic community? And in this part, I would like to open another parenthesis, because I'm going to use this example, Carlos, that we experienced during our first workshop. We were finishing the workshop on Marx and Hegel, and on the last session, we were supposed to be tackling on the subject of the post-colonial subject. And Carlos starts going off, talking about psychoanalytic institutions, and going this, and there, and that's where the session ended. After a few days, we both went and had some pints, and the first thing I told him was, what was that all about? We're supposed to be talking about post-colonialism. We were supposed to be talking about Achille Mbembe, what Surti told us. But the answer that Carlos told me, and it's included in sort of this work, is that the way that psychoanalytic institutions operate, especially at least in Mexico, it's just another way of getting inserted into the modes of production, being prey or being swallowed up by the capitalistic demands in such sense. So when we started talking about this, it got me thinking that it's not only about what happens in the consultation room, what happens with the analysand, but especially what happens within the psychoanalytic community, which is at stake here and which is a problem that we're both tackling. It's not about just training, but it's also a problem about transmission. So I owe you one for that, Carlos. Following on my text, the notion of community presents in itself a difficult problem to solve. The congregation of several individuals in a single unit. Freud himself was aware of the problems involved in forming a community, a group of consanguineous ties, of ancestral ties that determine kinship or entry into a particular clan or tribe. At the same time, Freud highlights the importance of a system of norms implicit in the taboo among the members of the group, a system that maintains an order and the validity of a community rules. Perhaps here is convenient to understand the fundamental difference between taboo and prohibition. While the former is a form of sacred rule, punishable by death, prohibition installs in its operation the logic of transgression. That which is prohibited is that which is most desired. How then do we understand this universal norm according to Levi-Strauss, which is defined as the only universal law? This is what Freud says, quote, almost every place where the totem governs, there is also the rule that members of the same totem do not enter into reciprocal sexual ties. That is, they are not allowed to marry each other, end of quote. In summary, what sustains and maintains the group is a prohibition of inbreeding. However, let's see that this is a much more complex than to merely say that a community is formed from a mere prohibition or retraction to marry within the clan. In the Elementary Structures of Kinship, written in 1949, Levi-Strauss refutes three explanations that until then defined the notion of the prohibition of incest. On the one hand, he disputes the dualistic explanation that maintains that the origin of the prohibition of incest is natural and social at the same time. In the same way, he continues to refute the natural explanation by realizing that such prohibition is not instinctive, since psychoanalysis itself proves that, on the contrary, the existence of this phenomenon is what demonstrates a universal attraction to incest. Finally, he argues against the social explanation that takes this rule as purely social. The interesting thing about Levi-Strauss' thesis is not so much the contradiction he finds in the face of these three explanations about the prohibition of incest, but the resolution he gives to this phenomenon. Quote, the prohibition of incest constitutes the fundamental movement through which, by which, and above all, in which the passage from nature to culture is fulfilled. The prohibition of incest constitutes precisely the link between nature and culture. End of quote. However, Levi-Strauss is clear in pointing out that this union is not static or arbitrary. More than a union, it is a transformation. In other words, the passage from nature to culture is nothing more than a break, a cut, where nature surpasses itself, where the simplest structures of psychical life integrate the simplest structures of animal life. and under which the action of a new structure is carried out, the advent of a new order. This rupture is precisely what the phenomenon of the prohibition of incest provides. From a psychological perspective, in order for a social structure to operate, the law must allow the drives to be tamed in favor of their entry into the cultural order. Drives that must be stifled in order to maintain the new structure. This, unfortunately, is Wilhelm Reich's perspective. Notwithstanding, here a problem arises, a problem that we, as a psychoanalytic community, carry since the Freudian left. How to overcome the oppression of the drives by society? I believe this is to be missing the mark, since it doesn't involve a meta-psychological approach in itself, as repression is not necessarily equivalent to oppression. I do believe that in meta-psychological terms, repression involves something else as well, other than just oppression. Rather than presenting a mere resolution to the problem of community, what Freud offers us is a crucial step in the constitution of the subject. Thus, Freud comes to proclaim that in all psychosexual development, as well as in people's psychical life, a concept emerges whose main role is to account for certain fixations or structuring processes, not only for the psychical apparatus, but also for the insertion of the subject in culture. This process is defined by Freud as the nuclear process of neurosis, quote, the bond with parents governed by incestuous appetite, end of quote. Nuclear complex, current complex, which will later be named Oedipus complex. However, let's take a moment and I'll take a brief detour to Aristotle's Politics. In Book 1, Aristotle defines man as, quote, an animal made by nature to live in a city, end of quote. Political animal, politikon son, animal of the polis. However, this statement is partially supported on the basis that man is the only animal given access to logos. Thus, to enter the city, to the political order of a community, it will be necessary to be structured by language. Belonging to culture is precisely belonging to language. In this way, Aristotle realizes, quote, he who is not able to live in a community or who does not need anything because he is enough for himself is not part of a city, end of quote. Those figures that are banished from the city, that is, from the political order, curiously will be defined as the god and the beast. Being part of community, joining communion as a link to what Freud highlights in part 4 of Totem and Taboo with the totemic banquet and its ramifications in the religious community, implies a renunciation, a consecration of the nuclear complex. In this passage from oikos to polis, a break is then implied. What does it mean to be a subject of the city? Is it the same to be defined as a citizen? What does the concept of political subject mean in metapsychological terms? What do we mean when a member of a clan or a member of an institution belongs to a certain social group? In short, what is the relationship between the singular and the collective? Aristotle places in the center of the formation of every city oikos, that is, relations with the wife, with the children, with the slaves. In other words, the oikos as a livelihood of the village, which in partnership created the city based on what community means, koinonia. In such matter, the territory was not the determining factor for the city to be formed, but the important thing was the relationship that individuals had with each other, the philia that they maintained through the political order. Thus, every individual, from his or her birth into language and entry into symbolic order, its fundamental origin implied in an oikos, a collectivity. We are always born into a collectivity. In summary, what concerns the subject of the polis is what we understand as a transition from incest to exogamy, to generate a community. However, what is the subject's place in the community beyond any religious sacredness? In Totem and Taboo, we appreciate a double shift in Freud's epistemological project. In 1910, he not only founded the International Psychoanalytic Association, an institutional body responsible for the transmission of psychoanalysis through its various affiliated associations, thus promoting the repetition of an ancestral model already known in the totem. But we can also venture to propose a hypothesis, another destination of the Freudian project, a project that I would call communal, with communal dies. Freud's communal project is taken from what is defined as the commons, cultural and natural resources accessible to all members of society. In this sense, we will extend such term in the broadest sense as to understand what is it that the brothers of the primal horde shared, what is common in each individual, in each singularity. How is it that the notion of the commons, that shared by the rest of the people, the public, that is, the communis, is decisive for the access of the subject in the community? Is the purpose of psychoanalytic practice to realize that deep down we are all part of the common people, like Jarvis Cocker would say? That we all share the same fears, uncertainties, and live in shared festivities? Unfortunately, such commonality is not so evident due to various differences established by neoliberal policies. In such matter, it is important to recall Samuel Tomczych's introductory remark in his latest book, The Labor of Enjoyment, quote, "If the psychoanalytic clinic is never entirely closed in the singularity of a clinical case, and instead always already unfolds within the political, then its theoretical and practical lessons directly concern the negative common ground of all subjects." End of quote. Perhaps it is the negativity that is common to all of us. How does each subject deal with this negativity? And I agree, following Samuel's statement in this introduction, I agree symptomatology is never disconnected from social framework. Surely, we have heard in our consultation rooms such statements as, "Us Martinez are not like that." Martinez is a very common Mexican last name. Or I'm going to adapt this example. A Smith from New York could never marry one of those Murphys from Boston. Yes, this sounds very Shakespearean. Enunciations that protect the emblematic ideal that ensures satisfaction and compliance to the narcissistic ideal, the safeguard of the family crest or coat of arms. What does someone mean when he or she defends the honor of his or her surname, or his or her membership to a psychoanalytic institution? Is it that what is at stake in each institution to protect the oikos as a place of narcissistic grounding, without any contention of institutional, clinical, or theoretical exchange? We have also heard that demonstrations will always be better developed far from our habitus, in another place that does not disturb our complacency, away from our oikos. But all these problems are precisely issues that are the responsibility of the subject of the polis. In this sense, Freud had already affirmed that the transition from incest to exogamy is a vital factor that guarantees her place in the community. In his 21st conference, Freud comments as follows, quote, the human individual has to devote himself to the great task of detaching himself from his parents, in this sense, oikos. Only after that release can he cease to be a child to become a member of the social community, in this sense, and polis, end of quote. The problem is not that the oikos disappears, because in turn the child, now an adult, will do the same to form his or her own oikos. But the problem is that the rooting of the oikos works more as a protector of filial narcissism. Can it be any different? That is, the common project really becomes a project of a few, of those who protect the totem and are not allowed to question its origins, much less its own freedom. Referencing back to Dufour-Mantel's proposition, isn't language today's our totem? Isn't language what we convey as the most democratic utensil that can ensure our place in the community? Such statement is far from being true. Therefore, is the purpose of the psychoanalytic clinic merely to adapt individuals to a society that requests order and plurality? Or should it be an agent of change in an individual sense where attention is paid to the process of subjectivity adjacent to its collectivity? And here I recall Vladimir's, I thank him for his conference that he gave us on the end of analysis and the implications that transference has as a mode of emancipation. This questioning is not a recent problem for psychoanalytic practice. Freud had described it for a long time, but it is important to continue studying it in order to combine it with what is understood today, for example, as the concept of freedom, at least in psychoanalysis. We can glimpse that the problem of freedom does not owe its objective in emancipating the individual from the community to which it belongs. And here I take a brief account on Axel Honneth's book, The Pathologies of Individual Freedom. He points out that the notion of individual and moral freedom must be involved in what he proposes as communicative freedom. Although personal and moral freedom have been great achievements of justice today, they seem to be insufficient since they generate from the dominant ideology feelings of loneliness, emptiness, and depression. We must all be free, happy, autonomous, and fulfill our dreams, regardless of our affiliation to our community. However, Honneth proposes that the individual can achieve this self-realization, this freedom, in projects that are shared in conjunction. Finally, I will say that there are several dangers in founding a community, many of them belonging to what we call oikos, disconnected from polis. Communities that forge dogmatism, non-thought, places that favor the self-enclosed environment against the openness, orthodoxy above aperture. And here I recall a brief statement that Amanda made during Alenka's book presentation on defining the difference between what we want and what we desire. And I think this is crucial to take into consideration, not only to find the in-betweenness as a political, but from my practice, to find the difference in the clinical. I think there's a big difference, because usually a lot of patients that come in for consultation, the first thing that they ask is, I want change. Although I'm not willing to endure all the process that change has to go through. So let's make it quick. And unfortunately, there's no fast track to analysis. I recall just recently, there was this patient that had recently lost her grandma. She was very close to her grandma. And she was crying, and what she told me is that the first thing she said is, I don't want this to hurt. And after the session was over, what we both came up with is that fortunately we are able to say that this hurts. Such bereavement, such loss has to have that place. And I believe that part of this new discussions that are being developed are trying to sort of promote that disconnection from ourselves. This is why I always come back to this lecture that Giorgio Agamben gave in Notre Dame in 2010, sort of being careful as to what we wish for. When he speaks about the kingdom and Christianity, he says, quote, Jesus Christ announced the arrival of the kingdom of God, but what we received in exchange was the church, end of quote. In such sense, how can we think the clinical psychoanalytic practice as a new space for hospitality, where radical otherness is confronted not only by the analysand, but mainly by the figure of the psychoanalyst? Is it possible to listen, to analyze the discourse of a ringleader, of a sicario? Where are the limits of analyzability today? Nevertheless, Freud postulated one key factor that may remain inconclusive, but notwithstanding, we must deal upon it. Ambivalence as a central concept to every political and clinical ordeal. Ambivalence is not something to resolve, but to endure. This is a concept, and that's basically my inconclusive concept, that ambivalence, although it has not been thoroughly worked with most of the post-Freudians, we do find that perhaps Melanie Klein started thinking about this integration, which is not the same as ambivalence, and perhaps a bit of Lacan, where he takes on love-hate, what's the Haine as some sort of dealing with ambivalence. But what I extract from Totem et Taboo is that Freud coins a concept that is not also included in this paper, which is the Vater complex, which is not the same as the Oedipus complex. And in that, I was intrigued because I was going through various dictionaries, and the Vater complex, Laplanche, Rodinesco, Chemama, Evans dictionaries, they don't give any deep account of what Vater complex really is about. It was only in Pierre Fedida's 1974 dictionary that he establishes the importance of Vater complex as this ambivalence, as this continuous ambivalence towards the father. So that's why my hypothesis, sort of my coming to my conclusion, is ambivalence is not something to resolve, but to endure. In conclusion, I am left with this question: is there anything more common than being, existence? Indeed, there is something more to be learned from Polynesia. Perhaps an attempt is not to solve this problem, but rather to build and debate our insertion into the polis in spaces such as this one. As Jean-Luc Nancy demonstrates, the community is simply the real position of existence. And as a final note, I would like to add what Nadia Bouali states in her manifesto entitled Open Statement, Clarity in the Midst of Euphoria. Thank you for sharing that. And what I define as one of, what? Oh, now it's not. There's no way to conceal those things. Now I'm a bit embarrassed. But so yeah, I'm just what I take from this manifesto, which and I thank you deeply, thank you for sharing that. It was very it pointed out a lot of the points that we were working on this second workshop. But what I define as one of the most crucial demands for today's political upheaval, be it clinical perspective or political demonstration, is the importance to understand the political in every subjectivity. I'm going to quote Nadia. She says, any transformation of social reality and capitalist structures must proceed through a revolt against sectarian identity politics. That is what is unfolding today. End of quote. Isn't the passage from oikos to polis similar to the passage from identity to identification? I don't know. Nevertheless, this is a crucial task that we must endure. Totem and taboo, totem or taboo, totem and or taboo. I don't know, I'm still ambivalent about it. Thank you.
So I think we have about 20 minutes, half an hour time for debate. I have two, but I will wait for it. Let me start with a quick remark, actually to both of you. Can I ask you about Silvio? First about, it's more a kind of also a question of understanding and maybe less to the way how you framed it. The problem of eros thanatos in Marcuse. I think you made clear this is not a symmetrical opposition, and you also made a clear distinction between an alleged biologism in Freud and reading it as a social theory that precisely problematizes the drawing of the distinction between what is to be considered as biology and what is culture. However, I mean, in this translation, it's instincts, or could we also come up with, let's say, rather than having two instincts, a dispersed, inconsistent drive that carries within a kind of its internal interruption, or put it differently, what is the problem, or what are the misreadings that are invited within such a reading that is a certain part of the Marcuse reception that comes with the alleged dualism? Let's put it this way, even though you exactly, I think very rightly, read it the other way around. Maybe we can start here.
Mm-hmm. I'll try. Thank you, Sani. I think that about this dualism or not, first of all, I think that the first question is about the instinct or drive translation, maybe. And that's very interesting because Marcuse knows about this kind of translation and why he makes this position. But I think that the first point could be Marcuse is talking with the psychologists of ego in America, and that's one point. But I don't know if it's a good answer for the question. And there is maybe a more interesting way to think about is Marcuse is making a connection with biology again. Then he is trying to say instinct really. That how he want to say it, and I think that I'm going to your question. He is trying to make this kind of biological question as a social question too. Then he translates instinctual questions as conflict, sociological perspective. Then this biological is a kind of sociological social statement, you know, and maybe that's very interesting to think more about it, because it's a dualism or not in this question that if I understood your question. And I think that is maybe Marcuse is thinking about a kind of dualism between thanatos and eros, but not as an extreme dualism, but they are interconnected. That's why I am thinking about extimacy in this relation. And it's very interesting to think not a polarity, ontology, a dualism that is the opposite, but they are interconnection. When death drive or death instinct moves in some direction, eros moves moves itself too. Then there's a kind of this interconnection. Okay.
Thank you. I also have one for Alejandro. Thanks for your paper. This is actually kind of a side aspect of the paper. It's more or less where you faded out and where you quoted misquoted, or not misquoted, let's say symbolically attributed, for the sake of the
synonymous.
synonymously, the name of Nadia in the place of a common negativity or whatever. But nevertheless, so everybody, yeah, exactly. So everybody's name could have been attached here according to the argument. But the argument itself is very relevant to us, and I wanted to press you a little bit on this. It was basically like the problem of our time, that we have a community based on oikos versus or that cannot make it to polis, and polis, of course, then ruled by the the lord of neoliberalism. Basically, the danger of that we also discussed earlier before, of having then kind of a right-wing, even populist oikos, and a liberal, neoliberal, centrist polis that can only play the capitalist game. So, how to overcome this kind of or what would be a strategy to overcome this, of course, false opposition, thought through a clinical practice. I think this was the moment that I took the note. I thought that sounds very interesting to me. Could you elaborate on this a little bit further?
Okay.
I'm not saying give me a solution, but I saw the problem that you.
Thank you, and again, I apologize for leaking this, but I found that to be really relevant. It's very important to make a distinction, at least in psychoanalysis and within the clinical practice, between identity and identification. I think that's something crucial, because identity, I mean, both terms are very complex, but what interests me about identity is especially the way that identity is placed within the psychoanalytic communities, and this problem that, going back to Carlos's intervention, was that there is no dialogue and there is no debate. Everybody is protecting their own identity. Even coming a little bit on the side to what we were talking with Alenka, how we stopped talking about sex, but now everything's about gender. And if you sort of mention anything about sex, immediately there's a defensive response. So it goes a little bit in that direction. In a second point, and this happens quite a lot in these institutions, is that a lot of identities are established depending on who you were analyzed by. And I find this very problematic. It's very typical to, like, oh, I'm a third generation Freudian, or second generation Lacanian. I analyze with such and such. And I find that problematic, because they're talking about identity, and the whole purpose of analysis, if I understand correctly, is that there is a process of idealization, there's a process of identification. Even if we take Michael Balint's notion of the end of analysis is the identification with the good parts of the analyst, which I find that very extremely problematic. Even if we take that properly, the whole purpose of transference is precisely to dissolve those identifications. There's a second term, notion that I would add, is disidentification. So all those sort of gatherings of psychoanalysts that start boasting this identity, I find it very discouraging, because the whole purpose of analysis is for the figure of the analyst, for that object R to finally fall. And it takes time. And if that doesn't fall, if we're not continuously sort of questioning if there is an analysis or not, I believe that we can easily fall in love with ourselves quite easily. And that's the narcissistic domain of identity. That's rather than posing a solution, thinking a little bit about what can be done within the clinical perspective, I am always trying to think that the clinical perspective is not an isolated perspective. It's not about this, oh, it only happens in the clinic and remains in the clinic. Talking to Vladimir, he was telling me about how in Brazil now there are these interventions on the plazas and open spaces of having analysis for people that can go into a private office. I am always trying to figure out how is this singularity entailed with the collective. And that singularity is always within a process of identification and disidentification constantly. But then again, that's not a solution, that's just sort of following up on this remark that you made.
See a certain degree of exhaustion here, but I see two comments. Yes, Mellon, please.
Yes, well, thank you so much for both papers. Well, first, a remark for Silvia. I don't know, Marcuse presupposed that there was a biologism in Freud, and that one has to work with the notion of life, which is there in Freud, and then turn this notion of life into a political issue. You know, here's the basic difference already between this take on Freud and the opinion take on Freud, where the drive is not a life function, to put it in a minimal way. And of course it's kind of symptomatic. One uses the word instinct, which Freud didn't use, instead of the word drive, because Freud used the trieb. And the trieb is always a sort of departure from life, departure from the circle of life, departure from the natural way that life is reproduced. So this is the first thing where there is I appreciate very much Marcuse's constant attempt to criticize the notion of life, because the usual way of looking at the notion of life is that this is somehow biological, therefore out of politics. But one should also be aware that this is not I don't think this is the way that Freud conceived this thing. Okay. And the second thing is also the question of the constant battle between Eros and Thanatos. And one should again remember that this is when Freud introduced the notion of drive in 3 essays, that exists in 1905, he never mentioned such a reality, because there was one drive which was profoundly contradictory in itself, which was the agent of unbinding and the agent of binding. And it was just one drive. And I think that the whole solution in civilization of these contents and in later Freud, like to divide the drive into the good drive and the bad drive, the drive of unification and the one of aggressivity and negativity, is I'm deeply Hegelian. I don't think it's a good solution. Because you divide into the good object and bad object, and you somehow lose. You say they are in internal conflict, but you lose somehow the internal conflictuality of one entity. And in the 3 essays, he had this. And I think he lost something by dividing into the good and bad part, the drives of the good and bad part. And the symptom of this is also his reference to Empedocles. He says, basically we're saying the same thing as Empedocles, although he was a mythical kind of This was in a mythical universe, now we have a scientific foundation for this. So in Empedocles already you have philia and nekos, the forces of philia, love, connection, union, and nekos, which is the forces of dispute, contradiction, whatever. No? And I think this is not a good move in Freud. And Marcuse entirely builds on this move in Freud. And I think the three essays on the theory of sexuality are more productive texts, where he introduced the notion of drive. He gave up on the radicality of that initial text. This is okay. This is my reading. This is where I have a problem with Marcuse. Okay. And Alejandro, yeah, that was great. I love the way that first he plays the documented root text not simply as a sort of Freudian account of the origins of whatever, but actually as a sort of response or struggle with the contemporary establishment of the psychoanalytic society. And I love the script that when discussing the post-colonial subject, you actually you discuss the current institutional arrangements of psychoanalysis in Mexico and Brazil. Okay, this is a post-colonial debate. I love this trend to sort of see it as an intervention, not a sort of rumination on the origins of the social. And the second thing, well, you put it now very well, but I think it's absolutely crucial, the difference between identity and identification. Because identification is a contradictory process with unsure results. This is identification. And identification is we have identification because we don't have an identity. Because a human being doesn't have an identity. There's no identity of a human being. I think this is very basic. This is what the S-barrier means, the split subject. There's no identity. This is why we need identification. The moment you say identity, you always enter into this narcissistic circle. Yes, and maybe I should elaborate a bit on this formula that I also like very much, not giving up on ambivalence or giving up on something because it's ambivalent, but enduring the ambivalence, which means, which is a difficult decision to not, if it's ambivalent, it has two sides. No? So it's a decision not to take one of the two sides, but to endure somehow with the ambivalence itself. Or how do you see it? Well, can you say something more about this?
Just thank you, Mladen, because it's a true question. I just like to think more about this kind of the position of the life in Marcuse, if it's the parti pris of the question, or the life is a construction, an historical construction that for Marcuse is an important part, but it's a cultural. But in this sense, I don't know if Marcuse and Lacan are so different to see this movement of the cultural for think the trip, the drive. Maybe it's a kind of talk that Lacanians and Marcusian could have to develop it. But it's true. Maybe it's not so good. Sometimes I'm very lost with Marcuse when he think about aggressive and eros, because it's very ambivalent in this case. Sometimes eros is perverted. It's not a good instinct, but it mobilizes the system in a deeper way, in a conservative way too. Then it's very interesting the question that you put to me, because I take to me to to think more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mladen. Trying to organize the three interventions that he set forth.
Okay, it's your comments. You needn't to take the questions.
Let's dialogue upon that, because part of the text of Totem and Taboo, which actually was started in 1910 and it didn't get to be published at the end in 1912, 1913. It does have some resemblance as your paper on the awakening of Kafka. And I recall, you gave that lecture in New York, and I recall you were saying how 1913 is the moment of awakening to Europe's most darkest hour, or something like that. And so in that sense, that got me thinking to what was Freud about, what was he all about in 1913? Because for the one matter, he just finished Leonardo, he finished Ratman, he finished a lot of clinical cases, and then he goes on to work on his technique texts and metapsychological texts. And somehow in between, it comes in this like sociological text that drew me attention, because it's a bit odd from both ends. However, while trying to understand what was politically happening in Freud, there is the establishment of the IPA in 1910. A second account that I find quite intriguing, that I wasn't able to delve into this in this paper, but it was in the workshop, is that in 1910, during the Nuremberg conference, he gives a lecture entitled "The Future Perspectives of Psychoanalysis," and that is the first time that he coins the term countertransference. And I believe there's only one or two places in his work where he's actually open about countertransference. Of course, there's that lost text on countertransference, but that was lost. And that was just trying to understand what was happening with the establishment of the IPA and the establishment of countertransference. For me, it has to do with his relationship with Jung and Ferenczi, an ambivalent relationship in a way. So that got me thinking into that, and how this text is sort of like paving the way in responding not only to the current situation in Europe, but also to responding to his situation, which is concerning what is going to guarantee the durability of his project of psychoanalysis beyond the institution. And technique is one key factor. And another element this is a personal favorite one, but is in 1912, before 1912, there were basically two journals, I can't remember the names, that were the journals that Freud and the rest of the gang started publishing there. But by 1912, the International Journal was established, and sort of Jung got kicked out, and Imago, which was more concerned to social, and that's, for me, that's another interesting sort of response in Freud as to what is he up to. And by introducing these two journals, I think that's an editorial endeavor at stake. Sort of, it's not only IPA, it's not only technique, but it's also editorially, and that's sort of what I started sort of like confabulating around this text. Concerning coming back to the identification, I like this remark of Massimo Recalcati. Is like when the individual protects his identity at most, that's when life perishes. In such sense, so yes, we always deal with identifications. And there's another remark that Massimo says, that Freud did not get to the death drive through compulsion repetition, through negative therapeutic reaction. He also arrived to the death drive through the ego, mainly narcissism. So, and I find that sort of to be, at least clinically speaking, what's at stake in identification and in analysis. And the ambivalent part, which I'm still ambivalent about it, but I cannot help recalling this Kantian joke that you mentioned on your seminar of how the left is the weaker side and how philosophy falls on the left side. And it's only there in order to give ground to or way to the right side. And at the end you mentioned something, it's not about left or right, it's about the march. It's about the march. And that sort of, I bring that because that for me it's what ambivalence sort of compiles. It's not about one side or the other. Yes, in some political arguments you take a side. However, the impossible professions always include this ambivalence in all of them. Yes, we don't like the current president. However, there's always this ambivalence to that position, to the professor, to the psychoanalyst involved. Some patients come in and yes, one they'll adore you, the next day they'll hit you in the face, but that's something that you have to endure. And fortunately, from the clinical end, I can see that at least there's a ground to work that. One of my main questions is, politically speaking, how do you ground that? And which is, I don't think it's that easy to ground it. However, the effort of enduring, I think that's what the purpose of the march is all about. That's what I can think of ambivalence.
Yeah, just going back to the topic, even if it's very local. That day I was talking about a new thing that is happening in psychoanalytical institutions, because we all know that the Freudian IPA it's constituted in a different way than the Lacanian schools. Lacanian school is really a new kind of social bond based on a different kind of temporality and trying to disintegrate any identification, but at the same time trying to configure a new cohesion that is not based on identity and these kind of things. That day I referred to a kind of neoliberal subjectivity that is now getting more popular in psychoanalytical institutions. I was referring that day to specifically Argentinian society whose founder is against Miller all the time, but I find this, he's criticizing Miller, but there's a kind of symptomatic thing there. It's exactly what is happening in every government, in every culture. It's that every time that you have a president or prime minister, you criticize it as totalitarian. And the solution for that is neoliberalism. It's like everything is totalitarian. So we need an anonymous, it's being against this, being against any president, any prime minister, being against any school, group, society. It's only it's giving space to neoliberal subjectivity. That was my point. And this point is very important because this guy who found this Lacanian society in Argentina is working like any Apple app in you know the name, it's Alfredo Edelstein. He works like that. He founds his own society and he's always against any institution. And if you are part of that group, you can get, if you're not part of the group, you can get some YouTube videos for free. But if you're part of them, you have to pay more. It's like an upgrade in the app, you know. It's exactly like that, and it's spreading all in all the world because he has this kind of entrepreneurial ethos. That's why I was talking about that. And it's happening in all Lacanian school societies. It's you monetize your YouTube videos and you ask for money and because you don't want to, not even an institution or like in the school, it's just a neoliberal kind of level zero of coercion. I could put that in another way. For Lacan, at least as I conceive that, there are three ways to give consistence to the non-subject or non-identity. One is identification, but imaginary identification. The other one is the symbolic solution. It's like having a symbolic place in the structure. But the third one is, for me, is the neoliberal subjectivity, which is through the subject, through the object. Like I have an account in Facebook, and I have to make some contents and working my own subjectivity as it was merchandise. But producing all the time, not only identifications, but embodying this form of merchandise. That was like, that's why I was talking about that day.
Comment, or would you want to respond?
No, just coming back, Carlos, to what we talked. I do recall you saying the entrepreneurial identification, and that's a problem we face in Mexico. And I like this what Laden remarks on. That's post-colonial. That's what we have to start thinking, because the problem with the transmission is not solely based on what happens on the couch, but what happens outside the couch. The schools, the YouTube, all this entrepreneurial that is responding to neoliberal demands. So we have plenty of work to do, I guess.
Thank you. On that note, we will close that third panel. Or do you want to say something?
No, I mean, we have dinner.
Of course we have dinner, but
This is the best closing statement in our
before we go, we will thank you.
Thank you, of course.
We thank you.
Yeah.
We thank you.
Thank you, Nadia.